I just wanted to dedicate this year to Mickey Davidow, who was my sensei and the sensei of thousands of people in South Africa over 5 decades. And unfortunately, he passed away yesterday afternoon, and the funeral was today. And just want to say a few words. Okay, I don't know if you can see both the pictures. I'm sure a lot of the guys attending this year have been students of his at one time or another. And just a little bit that I wanted to share is when I was at Pres, I actually saw Wayne Copping, and he said to me that he saw Mickey a few days ago, and generally his kids come with while his children were getting ready for Shabbos, and he said to Mickey, is there any sort of life lesson that you would like to suggest that I teach my kids? And Mickey said to Wayne that at the end of the day, if ever your children see a child that's playing alone and has no friends, the first thing your children should do is immediately come up to that person and befriend him. And the second thing that you should notice is that if any of your children ever notice a smaller boy being picked on by a larger boy, that they should intervene and obviously try and break it up, even at risk of injury to self, because at the end of the day, he couldn't stand bullying. And I can tell you that I've known Mickey for close to 20 years, and he helped me in various arenas. I think one of the most important lessons I learned from Mickey was the ability of having staying power. I wasn't particularly good at martial arts. My genetics are average, and my health disorder prevented me from becoming anything other than mediocre. But for Mickey, he taught me it wasn't about whether I compared well to others. It's, am I comparing well to myself and compared to previous performances that I've undertaken? In other words, am I improving all the time, both physically, mentally, spiritually, as a holistic person, as a result of martial arts? And that many times progress occurs in martial arts, not because of talent or necessarily genetics, but the constant striving and application and practice of the principles that I learned. In other words, hard work is what's going to achieve one's potential. And I think it's very apt that we're doing the shir for Mickey with the new Mishnah, because the Hebrew letters of Mishnah and Nashom are the same. So Mickey has got this chus, Sensei Mickey Davidow has this chus to do the Mishnah for the 8th daf. Sorry, not the 8th daf, the 8th perik, the 8th chapter of Bava Kamma, which is the 3rd book. And we have done 485 shirim, which is exactly the sort of lesson that Mickey taught us, is that whether or not we sometimes plateau in our learning, or sometimes we're having a growth period, the thing of it is to keep on persevering, and dedication to Torah and self-development, the growth of others, the development of both ourselves and our relationship to Hashem. So I'd like to dedicate this year to Sensei Mickey Davidow, and after Kevin teaches us the halacha, I'm happy to dedicate the Mishnah as well as the Gemara shir. Kevin, will you teach us?
Okay, so continuing with the theme of man of law, justice, and faith, it says the Talmud in Bava Kamma 55b to 56a, recognizing the limitations of human judicial courts, applies the term exempt according to the judgments of man, but liable according to the judgments of heaven, to a variety of cases in which a verdict in court is not congruent with the high moral codes of behavior required of a person. And Rav Yehoshua said, there are 4 acts for which the offender is exempt from the judgments of man, but liable in the judgment of heaven. They are breaking the fence in front of a neighbor's animal, bowing his neighbor's grain towards a fire, hiring false witnesses, and having evidence to exonerate another, but refusing to testify on his behalf. Okay, let's. I don't know if you must remember that. That's actually interesting. Sure. That it's actually in Bava Kamma. So, and I'm sure Mickey says here, what does it say? It was something I read here. Was a person of great integrity, and I mean, he taught me. I mean, I wasn't that. I did judo with him. So actually, one of the few things I remember is I knew he taught me how to fall and how to go into a roll. I remember that vividly, and this is like 40 years ago when there was a dojo at Cornet City. I don't know if you remember, Damon.
Sure. Wow.
And he was a very friendly Manchester guy.
Amazing. I don't know, he taught you too, Kev. Thank you. I'm going to share the screen. And this is the new Mishnah before we hit the Gemara of the third book of Bava Kamma. Now, I'm just actually going to expand the Mishnah to be able to read it a little bit better, because as I'm getting older, my eyes are getting a little worse. Hence the glasses, not the contacts. All right. So basically, the chapter discusses the laws of physical injuries inflicted by one person on another. Now, the Mishnah details 5 types of compensation an assailant could be liable to pay. Now, by the way, guys, the reason that we're dealing with physical injuries in this chapter is the 7th chapter dealt with issues such as theft and robbery. Now, what's going to generally happen if there's a robbery is that people are going to get injured. If there's a theft and you know that somebody's taking your goods, there's a natural instinct to defend what is yours. And what happens is, we learned in Sanhedrin, Gavin and I, with Rav Simcha Steinhauer, that sometimes not only can there be injuries of physical nature of a conflict between a innocent person and a thief and a robber, but it can even come down to murder, where in fact the laws of Sanhedrin deal with capital punishments. So, one who inflicts a wound on his fellow can be liable on account of him for 5 things. So there are 5 aspects of the injury. The first one is for nezek, actual damage. The second one is tsar, pain. The third aspect is healing. Now, the 4th aspect is loss of employment. What do we mean? Is the time it takes. It's called beshevet. So if you look at the word Shabbat, rest, there's a certain amount of recovery time that's needed. And that loss of employment isn't for the actual loss of ability to do the job he could previously do before he was injured. That actually goes towards nezek, actual damage. This is for the convalescing, the healing process that's required for a person to recover somewhat. Not for the injury aspect of what they could do prior and what they can do now. That's an actual damage. Now, humiliation doesn't occur in every case. It does generally occur if one person assaults another in public, simply because that person's humiliation is a very traumatic experience, sometimes even more than physical damage. But if somebody is alone and they're assaulted by a thief or a robber, that humiliation aspect doesn't kick in, because they're not viewed as being weak or embarrassed in front of others. So the Mishnah obviously elaborates on the 5 categories. So the first one is obviously, how do we assess for damage? If the assailant blinded the victim's eye, cut off his hand, or broke his leg, we view the victim as though he was a servant being sold in the market, and we appraise how much he was worth before he was wounded and how much he is worth now. So that bearing in mind, one of the things that you guys have to realize is that firstly, we can't apply a subjective measure of how much the victim would pay not to have sustained his injury. So, for example, when you're looking at the aspect of pain, okay, and you say you're in the Middle East, and somebody turns around to you and says, how much would you pay for an anesthetic before we chop off your hands? Say, for example, the Taliban. You would empty out your bank account not to go through that harm. So what we're saying is that's not a subjective measure. Well, that in fact is very subjective. It's not an object measure of how much the victim would pay not to go through that pain. What we're saying is we need an objective criteria to judge this. Because somebody would offer a fortune to have their eyesight back or the amputated hand restored. And that would unfairly bankrupt the assailant. So the Mishnah basically seeks equitable means of assessing the actual damage. In other words, one that obviously does provide restitution to the injured party, but also doesn't completely permanently bankrupt the assailant. So we're going to go through what sort of method that is. Now, there's liability to 5 types of compensation. And those 5 types of compensation only apply to deliberate damage. Okay? Now, if there is inadvertent injury, in other words, there is complete negligence, but there wasn't the intention to harm. It's not like assault. The guy did something stupid. He should have been more careful. There was negligence and somebody else got harmed. So then there's only 3 categories of damage, and that is the actual damage, and you would have for pain, and for pain, for healing, and for loss of employment, but certainly not for the humiliation. The loss of employment also occurs, just not humiliation. Okay. Now, what happens is if there's no negligence involved, in other words, where he's liable for damage, but in that particular case, it was an unavoidable mishap. He has to, if it was absolutely unavoidable, there's not even the basic damage. If it was avoidable, but not, then it goes into the category of negligence. So what we are talking about is what's this issue about being a servant sold in the market? So what we're actually saying here is that a valid measure of a person's physical value is the price he could command if he became impoverished and sold himself as a Hebrew servant. Where's this from? Shmot, Exodus in the 21st chapter. So basically the depreciation of a victim's value as a worker resulting from his wound. In other words, the difference in the price between what he could command as an employee, let's say, before the assault and afterwards, and that's a bona fide measuring tool of the physical damage and financial loss he sustained. Okay? An assailant might pay that amount. Now, obviously, the Rosh objects to Rashi's interpretation because the injury in question is a permanent one, whereas the Hebrew servant's period of servitude is only 6 years. So the Rosh therefore learns that we view the victim as though he was a Canaanite slave who sold for life. But the bottom line of it is we cannot look at this about in the category of if somebody had their own business and as a result was injured and can no longer run their own business, because that would bankrupt the assailant. It has to be with regards to an employee-employer relationship and what their market-related rate was. In those days, it was putting yourself into servitude to be able to earn a living, and that was the objective measure as if you were an employee on the market. So as the Mishnah says, and we appraise how much he was worth before he was wounded and how much he's worth now. So how do we calculate the amount to be paid for in pain? If an assailant burnt the victim with a spit or injured him with a nail, even on his fingernail, a place where it doesn't make a wound. So what we're saying is, in that case, where it doesn't actually cause a visible or permanent injury or permanent damage, but there's pain, you would pay for the pain aspect. And when it says that it would create an actual injury, it goes without saying you pay for that, but you even pay for pain as a standalone. As far as the Mishnah, when it continues, we estimate how much money a man like this wishes to take to suffer pain. What we're saying is what we have to appraise is that different people suffer pain in a different manner. Somebody that's physically sickly is more delicate, and therefore the pain he suffers is greater. So his payment would be greater. If you've got a guy that does bodybuilding 5 days a week and is a bit of a breaker, he's not going to suffer the same amount of pain because he's a very physically strong person. As far as healing is concerned, if one struck another, the assailant is obligated to heal him. So what does that mean? Is that even if the assailant is a doctor, for example, and injures him for whatever reason, then the victim is entitled to say, I don't want to be sorted out by him. Even if it's going to cost the doctor who happens to be the assailant money, he can request a different doctor. It has to go that far. So if sores develop on the victim, it depends. If they develop because of the wound, the assailant is liable. If not because of the wound, he's not liable. Now, guys, that might seem obvious and superfluous, but what it's saying is that sometimes the wound can look like it's actually healed, but it hasn't healed. It festers again or manifests itself months later with an infection, etc. But if all of that was caused by the injury, even the wound in the surrounding area, it has to be taken care of until it's fully healed. If the wound healed and returned, the assailant is obligated to heal him completely. If it healed completely and then returned, the assailant is not obligated to heal him. So what he's saying is that if the wound's healed properly and sufficient time is given, if he's got a compromised immune system, we don't stretch it that far that the assailant has to continue for the rest of his life to pay him for an injury that reoccurs. I mean, if you're playing rugby and somebody has an injury and it's permanent, etc., you pay for the losses and the pains and the recovery, etc., but you don't pay every time he's got a little bit of pain years later, because as the body deteriorates, it keeps injuries. So as far as loss of employment is concerned, we view the victim as though he were a watchman of cucumbers. So what's this issue about a watchman of cucumbers? While the victim is ill and is unable to work, the assailant must pay him the daily wages of a watchman of a cucumber field. So if you turn around and say, but hang on a second, this guy was fully functional in his own business, etc., what about that? Well, that actual damage goes under nezek, actual damage. What we're talking about here is that amount that he's paid while he's recovering for what he's capable of doing after the injuries. And if he hasn't got his limbs, he's still capable of watching a cucumber field. So whatever that salary is, even at his new life situation, that's what we pay him for while he's recovering. Because the actual amount of damage of what he was able to do potentially as an employee of what he's able to do now, that's in nezek, actual damage. So the assailant need not pay more than that amount for the recuperation, since the victim, actually having lost his hand, is incapable of doing more work even after he recovers from his illness, according to Rashi. Okay, so we basically say, in that particular case, we view the victim as though he was a watchman of cucumbers, since the assailant has already given him the value of his hand or the value of his foot in nezek, actual damage. As far as humiliation is concerned, it's all according to the humiliator and the humiliated. So what does that actually mean? Is that if somebody has got a high position in public and they're embarrassed, it's deemed that it's more embarrassing than if, like for example, if he's got a prominent political position. And this here of somebody pulling somebody else's pants down, for example, will permanently ruin his career in the political arena or whatever. That obviously has far more humiliation than if it was somebody that was unemployed and nobody knows who the guy is. I found this a little bit difficult to deal with, but it's the way it did work. Now, just as remembered from before the humiliation, when you pay the nezek, the actual damage, the assailant compensates the victim for reducing him from his previous well-paying occupation, obviously if he had one, to that of a cucumber field watchman. So the loss of employment, shevet, the assailant is only liable for the time the victim is completely idle and can't work, even as a cucumber watchman. But for actual damage of potential, what he could earn and what he can't earn now, is determined at the market value if one sold themselves as an employee or slave, as far as that's concerned. All right. So guys, we finished the particular Mishnah. We're gonna start.
Can I say something, Damon?
Of course, Kevin.
Okay, so you were saying, just correct me if I'm wrong, that if somebody had an injury that healed quite quickly, they couldn't actually claim damages if it didn't really affect them. Because I'll tell you what happened to me when that motorbike went into me. I went to a lawyer, and he said, unless you have permanent damages, and I fully recovered. I mean, but I can't actually claim against the guy because I'm back to normal now. It didn't stop me from working or make any permanent damages, so I couldn't claim against the guy.
Okay, so two things. Firstly, secular law is different to Talmudic law, and according to Talmudic law, this person would owe you for a few things. The first thing is that if at all, as a result of injuries, you were not able to work and you had loss of income for whatever reason, even if it was before the trial date, during that period where you were incapacitated or at least not able to function to your normal self, that should have been paid for. Even if by the time it came to trial, you were well at that point, okay? Then what would actually be paid according to Talmudic resources would be for pay, for the tsar. So as far as that's concerned, Kevin, you went through pain. You definitely went through pain. You might not have gone through humiliation because it was an accident and those things happen, but you also had a certain injury. But what you're not paid, and you might have had the convalescing, the actual damages, but you never sustained permanent damages.
Yeah.
So that person is not entitled to pay that. But there's certainly payment for the pain aspect, the recovery basis, the loss of income that you could have earned by, which goes to actual nezek, etc., apart from the recovery period. So these things get taken into account.
In Talmudic law.
In Talmudic law, in secular law, you know, it's I guess what you can prove. Look, the reality is, I hope this guy was sorry. I really do.
Yeah.
Not that matters, but I hope next time he's more careful. Was he injured at all, by the way, before we go to the Gemara?
Yeah. I don't know to what extent, but he also went to hospital.
Okay, but I think
to Ichilov, where actually Arthur is, that's where we both went.
Okay, well, I think he'll be a little careful next time, hopefully.
Well, unless they've taken his license away, which they should. So anyway.
So what we're doing is we're hitting the Gemara now. So the Gemara is now going to focus on one particular point, and it says, look, if you look at the first category of payment, which is nezek, it's actual damage. We want to know why is the assailant merely obligated to pay for the damage he inflicts? Because Hashem states, the merciful one states, an eye for an eye. Hence, I would actually say he must actually lose an eye. That's what the Gemara is saying, is if you look at the pasuk quite literally, and you look at Shmot, Exodus chapter 21, verse 24, it would seem that the retribution for wounding another person, that the assailant should be similarly wounded by the court. Now, it's not that the Gemara doubts as if there is a monetary payment in terms of compensation, but we're saying, how can you actually know this if you read the verse literally? If you look at Moshe at Sinai, every Sanhedrin from then onwards, even when Moshe Rabbeinu was presiding over cases, they were adjudicated accordingly to that an eye for an eye shouldn't be taken literally, but it's an intention of what to pay, what that value of the eye is in monetary compensation. So what I wanted to do was just cover certain aspects, is that how do we, there's something called lex talionis. I don't know if you guys know what that is.
It's Latin, obviously.
Yes. Yes. But what is it about, Kevin? Do you know?
I know Lex, I don't know what Lex, I've heard the word Lex, talionis, I'm not sure. Maybe Gavin would know.
I can explain to you, but Gavin, explain if we went through it once before. Gav, talk. No, you're unmuted, but I can't hear you. Where's your mic? I can't hear you, Gav.
I can hear him.
Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, now I can. Yes, talk to me.
All right. Sorry, I didn't actually hear that exact word that you said, and I'll tell you if I know it or not.
So there's a term. There's a term that's written called lex talionis, and it's actually a principle that's found in the book of Shmot, Exodus chapter 21, verse 23 to 27. So that's the principle. If you read it according to the Chumash, literally, many non-Jewish nations do read it. They think it's measure for measure, reciprocal damage. You take out an eye is taken out of you. You take a limb off, a limb is taken off from you. So what does this actually mean, lex talionis? So it's interesting is that the Romans were quite vicious. It's a Latin which means law of the claw. So what it is it bears the same principle that a person that injured another person be penalized in a similar degree by the injured parties. Now, obviously, the soft interpretation is from the Torah point of view, where you compensate for the value of the loss. But why in Babylonian and Roman law that didn't work like that? It's because as early civilizations grew, the less well-established system for retribution of wrongs, feuds, and vendettas threatened the entire social fabric. So what would happen is, like, if you look at the Romans, well, the mafia came from the Italians and the Romans, is that if somebody cost his father a leg, they would go and kill him. So in other words, the retribution superseded the actual damage caused. The law of the claw was there to say that you couldn't damage the other party according to Roman and Babylonian law worse than that person was injured. So there's a concept of lèse-majesté, which means crimes against God or against a monarch, they were punished more severely. But in essence, according to even Babylonian law, at which Roman law came from that, they had to put a limit on such actions, restricting the retribution to be no worse than the crime. Okay? So also in the Torah view, in Leviticus, Vayikra chapter 24, verse 19 to 21, it's used in its sense of a much milder form of financial punishment. But the thing of it is that I've never understood, and tomorrow we'll tackle this issue. The entire issue in the Gemara tomorrow is how do we not interpret it literally from the Chumash, and what's the evidence in the exegesis, as well as the Gezei Rishava and many other methodologies, to realize that in fact, when you look at Bamidbar, Numbers, chapter 35, verse 31, these comparisons are there to actually tone it down a bit. It's called Samuchim. So it's a principle like Gezei Rishava. How do we learn certain lessons? By bringing similar situations in the Talmud at which financial compensation was there instead of physical retribution. So by all intents purposes, yes, if you're that callous with somebody that you take off their limb, you should lose a limb. But we don't do that in civilized society today. So the entire Gemara is going to deal with that tomorrow, but in the scope of 4 minutes instead of 40, we're not going to...
That's supposed to be the monetary value of that limb. That's what the compensation is.
Correct. And it's not a subjective monetary value of saying, because you know what, if one's about to have their hands chopped off, you'd pay anything to get your hand back or your eye back. It has to be objective criteria at what a person would lose in terms of earning potential and other aspects. The only thing that worries me a little bit about this is that if the breadwinner wasn't injured, but it happened to be the wife that wasn't working or the children, it bothers me that they should get a far amount less. But I'm not quite sure how the law works in terms of application. I'm sure that their limbs were also seen as value, but you have to pay a breadwinner more because you're going to incapacitate an entire family financially where they're going to be needing charity and tzedakah, etc. So there's much more of a serious implication with the breadwinner on a practical level. I know Arthur knew Sensei Mickey Davidow as well. He's just riding his bike, so we want him to keep safe. I don't want Arthur to visit Mickey anytime soon. And
But I wanted to add something. As well. You mentioned we've done over 450 shiurim. You said at the beginning.
485 shiurim. This is 486.
Okay, so even better. 485 shiurim, and you've had 100% attendance. How's that?
Guys, I can't thank you enough. To learn with my friends has been an absolute privilege for me. I couldn't think of it's a dream come true. Really, it really, really is a dream come true.
Yeah, and for us too. Well done. Well done to everybody. Yeah. Well done to you. It's really amazing. Everybody's played their part. We all have a role to play in this, and we've all played our part. And well done to everybody. Thank you. Thanks, Damon, for pushing this.
100%.
And to get Damon, Kohanim, Levim, and Yisraelim at the same forum. Out of 4 people, we've got all the tribes, all the covered. All the types of Jews.
Exactly. And please God, by the way, Rabbi Cohen, who has a smicha, at which I do not, and it's just friends learning with friends, is going to speak to us because he's so proud of all of you guys for your achievement. And he just said that it's incredible. And it's exactly like that principle from Sensei Mickey Davidow at continually doing the work, whether you plateau or whether you have highs or lows, that it's just about a competition with yourself and not pulling the other down, but rather raising the other up. And together, you're able to reach your potential in a far more synergistic way than just on your own. So it's pretty appropriate. And Rabbi Cohen said he'll speak to us at our first opportunity, and he just wishes you guys Yishakayach.
Please just be careful. Don't oversell us to Rabbi Aaron Cohen. Otherwise, he'll be phoning us all hours of the evening for questions. All right.
Exactly. Yeah. That's
like the last thing in the world we need.
Yeah.
So just be truthful. Just say, listen, you've changed him from what's it, subhuman to sort of human sort of characters now. So we're halfway there, and we're still working. We're still a work in progress.
100%, but it's really Rabbi Cohen has been a great resource since he knows Shas backwards to have helped us over these few years. Really.
Yeah, no, he's the fact that you have direct access to him at like any point in time, like you can pretty much get the same day response from him, which is quite remarkable. There's not many people who have that sort of connection with anybody of that caliber. It's not so easy. Yeah? So shkach to you, because it obviously does help us as well.
Yeah.
And thanks to Rav Simcha Steinhauer, taught us Gemara